Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. We find ourselves up north today in a town called Sycamore. Sycamore is a small town in northern Illinois that was considered safe and idyllic. This is the type of town where people didn't lock their doors, and they really didn't need to. The crime rate was exceptionally low compared to other cities in Illinois. This appealed to families with small children that wanted that safe, small-town feel, including the Ridulph family. Michael and Frances Ridulph were parents to 11-year-old Chuck and 7-year-old Maria. And you also have to remember, aside from this being a small town, it was also a different time. In 1957, no one thought twice about their kids playing outside, even though it was getting darker. It was December 3rd, and a fresh layer of snow had fallen that day. Maria Ridulph loved playing in the snow and wanted to play with her friend Kathy, who lived nearby. Even though it was after 6 p.m., this was a regular thing for the kids in the neighborhood, and their parents were okay with it. Maria met Kathy on the street corner, and they played with their dolls in the snow for a while until a man approached them. He introduced himself as Johnny and offered to give Kathy and Maria piggyback rides and stayed and played with them for a while. After playing in the snow for a while, Kathy said that her hands were getting too cold, so she decided that she would run home really fast and get her mittens. Kathy ran home quickly so she could hurry back and continue playing with Maria and Johnny before she had to return home for dinner time. Kathy only lived a few houses down from the street corner, so she knew she would be in and out really quick. Kathy was not worried at all, as they'd never really had any reason to fear anyone, and Johnny had only been nice to them. However, when Kathy returned, she couldn't find Maria or Johnny anywhere, and she became concerned. Kathy thought that maybe because of the snow or the fact that it was getting darker, maybe Maria had just gone home. So Kathy walked over to Maria's house to check and spoke with her brother Chuck. When he opened the door, Chuck said, "No, she isn't here. I thought she was outside playing with you." Kathy reluctantly went back to the street corner to look again for Maria, but when she didn't see her the second time, she went back to Maria's house and asked Chuck to help her look. It was really starting to get dark, and they were getting more and more worried. After walking around the neighborhood and finding no trace of Maria, Chuck and Kathy went to their parents to tell them Maria was missing. After spending over an hour looking for her, they then called police. Luckily, the police were concerned, and they took immediate action. They too were afraid that something had happened to Maria. Along with the police, several volunteers from the neighborhood joined in on the search, hoping if they didn't find her, they would at least have a clue as to where she might have gone. Police set up roadblocks and went door to door asking if anyone had seen her. They also looked in and around neighbors' properties to see if maybe she was hiding or possibly being held captive. She was unfortunately nowhere to be found. Frances, Maria's mother, had described Maria as being very high-strung. She said that her daughter was a nervous girl, and if she got in any trouble, she would become hysterical. She said in an interview shortly after Maria disappeared that someone would probably have to kill her to keep her quiet. I am the only one who could calm her down. Her family had also described her as being a screamer, as well as being afraid of the dark. Because of all this, it is extremely unlikely that she would have gone off on her own. Several hours had passed, and there was still no sign of Maria. However, the police did find, buried in the snow, Maria's doll and 2 sets of footprints leading away from the neighborhood. There was a small set of footprints, determined to be from a child, most likely Maria, and a larger set belonging to a man who, at this point, we can assume as belonging to Johnny. 2 neighbors also told police that around 7 p.m. they heard a child screaming, but didn't see anything. They didn't think anything of it until they heard about Maria's disappearance from police, which is why they didn't report this sooner. After searching and searching with no avail, the police had determined that Maria had most likely been kidnapped and did not go off on her own. Which, yeah, thank you. That much we've gathered. The crime had been dubbed the Piggyback Kidnap, and the local police decided to bring the FBI in on the case because they knew the man who had introduced himself to the girls as Johnny was most likely involved in the crime, but they didn't know who he was and had no way to find out. The police and the family did have hope that the FBI would be able to help them. They unfortunately just had so little to go on. About 110 miles away from Sycamore, in a town called Galena, a farmer and his wife were foraging for mushrooms when they came upon the partially clothed skeletal remains of a small child. There appeared to have been an attempt to conceal the remains under a nearby knockdown tree. Upon testing, the remains had been determined as belonging to Maria. On April 26, 1958, this kidnapping case became a homicide investigation. At this point, because Maria was not taken over state lines, the FBI handed the case over to the Illinois State Police. This discovery, as you can imagine, put the already on-edge community of Sycamore into a more terrified state. They felt that this seemingly random abduction and murder could have happened to any one of their children. Very scary. Police really didn't have any leads when it came to the man who had identified himself as Johnny. While speaking with Kathy, who was presumed to be the last person to have seen Maria alive, as well as the only other person who they know had come in contact with Johnny, said that she had never seen or met the man prior to him taking Maria. They had shown Kathy a photo lineup, hoping that this would spark her memory, but Kathy was never able to identify the man that had approached them that night. Having nothing further to go on, the case began looking as if it would go cold. They had a handful of suspects they looked into, including a man named John Cherry, who at the time was their primary suspect. John had come to America from Northern Ireland when he was 7 with his mother and stepfather after World War II. His father had died early on in the war, and when his mother remarried, he took his stepfather's last name, Tessier. Over the years, John's mother had 6 more children, and they lived in Sycamore, Illinois, just around the corner from the Ridulph family. By the time John was in 10th grade, he had been expelled from school for calling his teacher a name. His ambition at that point was to join the Air Force. At the time of Maria's disappearance, John was 18 years old and confirmed to be living at home. Just after Maria's body was discovered, a tip was called into the FBI to look into John Tessier as a possible suspect. It is unclear who called in the tip, as there was some speculation that it came from a neighbor or even John's parents trying to clear his name, as they felt he would have been investigated sooner or later, since his name was basically the same as the presumed murderer. On December 4th, 1957, the day after Maria had gone missing, while police were going around the neighborhood and interviewing neighbors, they stopped at the Tessier home and spoke with John's sisters, Jeanne and Catherine, and they told investigators that John had been home with them the night before on the 3rd. However, they would later testify that this was not true. John's versions of events that night were that he was in Rockford, Illinois, which is about 40 miles away from Sycamore. He said that he had gone there to enlist in the Air Force. He also said that he had been in Chicago from December 2nd to December 3rd, where he underwent physical exams, and records were found that confirmed he was at the recruitment station. He said that after he left the recruitment station, he spent the rest of the day sightseeing in Chicago before getting on the train and heading back to Rockford. He got off the train in Rockford at 6:45 p.m. He then went to the post office and called his parents to come pick him up from the train station. He had left his car at home, so someone must have driven him to the train station 2 days prior. Upon review of the phone records, there was a collect call placed from the post office in Rockford to the Tessier home at 6:57 p.m., and the operator who was on the line had written down John Tessier as the person who called. After making his call, John had then met with officers at the recruiting station in Rockford to drop off his enlistment paperwork. The recruitment officers confirmed that they did speak with John around 7:15 that evening. One of the officers did note that he had expressed some concerns about John's credibility and conduct. John was later brought into the police station to take a polygraph test, and he passed. Because of his alibi and his passing of the polygraph test, he was then taken off the suspect list, and the FBI closed his report on December 10th, 1957. They noted that no further investigation is being conducted regarding the above suspect. After that, John left the next day to attend basic training. Kathy was never shown a photograph of John and was never asked to identify him. And how much would she remember anyway? Of all the photos police had shown Kathy early on in an attempt to narrow in on a suspect, John was not among them. Remember, at the time of him introducing himself and playing with them, her radar wasn't up. She might not have noticed specific identifying things about him that she would be able to point to in a lineup. Also, side note, a lot of people think they have a photographic memory. They don't. I remember an episode of Oprah a long time ago where someone came in and ran through the audience and did something, and then 10 minutes later they asked people in the audience to identify him, and every single person picked the wrong guy. And these people, although taken by surprise, would have had their radars up much more than Kathy would have. At the time, she felt Johnny was not a threat and didn't treat the interaction as such. Anyway, moving on. John had served in the military for 13 years and had worked his way up to the rank of captain. After leaving the Army, he then moved to Seattle, Washington, where he enrolled and graduated from the King County Police Academy in 1974 and became a police officer in the small town of Lacey, which is in the northwest part of Washington. He eventually moved to a police department in Milton, Washington, and while there, he frequently clashed with the chief, who had a long list of complaints about John's work and conduct, and had tried to fire him on multiple occasions. As the years went on, he eventually moved to Tacoma, Washington, but in 1982, he found himself in trouble once again. While in Tacoma, John had taken in and befriended a 15-year-old girl named Michelle Weinman, who was a runaway. Michelle knew John through her friend, who knew he was a police officer, so she trusted him. However, after living with John for just a short time, Michelle had testified that John was getting very touchy-feely and acting inappropriate with her. John was charged with statutory rape, which was a felony. After plea negotiations, John had eventually pled guilty to communicating with a minor for immoral purposes, which carried the lesser consequence as a misdemeanor. For this, he was sentenced to 1 year of formal probation and was subsequently terminated from the police department on March 10th, 1982. On April 27th, 1994, John Tessier legally changed his name to Jack Daniel McCullough. He said it was to honor his late mother, but some people believe it was from the negative attention he had garnered from his cases over the years. By 2011, Jack was living at a retirement community in northwest Seattle and working as a security guard. In 1997, the Sycamore police lieutenant had closed the case by naming a man named William Henry Redmond as the man responsible for abducting and killing Maria. William Henry Redmond was a former truck driver and carnival worker from Nebraska. In 1988, he had been charged with the 1951 murder of a young girl in Pennsylvania, but that case was later thrown out because the investigating officer on the case refused to name his informant. He was on police's radar already because he had been a suspect in the Beverly Potts case, which, if you recall, we talked about a few weeks back. He had allegedly told another inmate that he had committed a crime similar to Maria's. The lieutenant also believed that he exhibited similar behavior to Johnny, and based on how Kathy had described him, thought he might have been similar in appearance. The lieutenant's report was criticized due to lack of evidence, as well as allegations of political motivation. Because he was never able to explicitly elicit a confession, and because the evidence was circumstantial at best, it would have been very difficult to convict him. Because of this, the case was marked closed but not solved, so there was hope that a suspect would be found in the future. William Henry Redmond died in 1992, having never confessed to any involvement in Maria's disappearance or murder. The case stalled. It wasn't until many years later that there was suddenly a break. In 2008, a woman had come forward and told police she knew exactly who had killed Maria Ridulph and exactly where to find them. This woman's name was Janet Tessier. Janet had told police that her mother had passed away and on her deathbed revealed that Janet's brother John had killed their neighbor Maria. Remember John? Former neighbor, previous suspect? As you recall, John had changed his name to Jack, so we will be referring to him as Jack from here on out. After so much time had passed, Janet's mother Eileen said she didn't want Jack to get away with murder, and that Janet had to make sure that he faced the consequences. Better late than never, but is it? At first, Janet wasn't all that sure that her mother was telling the truth. This was the first time that she was hearing of it, and nothing of the sort had ever been discussed or alluded to in the past. Was her mother and brother Jack really holding on to this secret for all these years? Janet had remembered while growing up that Jack was a suspect early on in the investigation, but had been cleared by police in 1958 because he had an alibi on the night of the abduction. She did have to wonder, though, was her mother telling the truth? What motive did she have for sharing this on her deathbed? What was the point of coming clean at this point? Nothing could be done other than clearing her own conscience. Was her brother really a murderer? This was a troubling thought, especially since her sister Jeanne had previously made claims that Jack and his friends had raped her when she was a teenager. Was it possible that he could have done something like this to a little kid? She believed so. After sharing their suspicions with investigators, Jeanne said that Jack had once threatened her with a gun, as well as assaulting her sister, and knew he had done it to other girls too. Another young woman had come forward and alleged that Jack had given her a piggyback ride and had refused to put her down until her father intervened. Janet had said that their mother revealed on her deathbed in January 1994, those two little girls, and the one who disappeared. John did it. John did it. You have to tell someone. It was after his mother had passed that he had changed his name from John to Jack, so she was still calling him John at this point, since she'd only ever known him as John. Sorry for the confusion, but this was the direct quote. This bomb that was just dropped on Janet meant to her that her brother Jack was the one who kidnapped and murdered little Maria all those years ago. She later found out from her sisters that their mother had lied to investigators the night of the crime. She also found out that her sisters had suspected he was the killer for years. At the time of Eileen's revelation, she was currently receiving treatment from cancer and was on morphine, and according to her doctor, she was disoriented. I don't know, that statement seems pretty lucid to me. When Eileen passed, Jack was told not to attend the funeral. If you're wondering why it took Janet so long from hearing about this to getting the police involved, she actually spent 14 years trying to get help from law enforcement with literally no avail. She finally was able to get Lieutenant Patrick Solar of the Sycamore Police to take another look at the case, including her mother's statement. Lieutenant Solar was actually the one who had concluded that Maria's killer was most likely William Henry Redmond. He said that if Janet had never contacted him, he would have never considered Jack as a suspect. The Tessier family was pretty well known to police. In a good way. Janet's father had painted all of the Sycamore police cars. And because Jack was cleared by police in 1958, he felt that there was nothing more there. But when he was contacted by Janet in 2008, all those years later, The cold case unit decided to take a deeper dive into the case, including Jack's seemingly, at the time, airtight alibi. As the police reviewed the evidence, they found that Jack could have kidnapped Maria and driven to Rockford, 35 miles away, to make his phone call and establish his alibi. They found that Maria would have been kidnapped no later than 6:20 p.m., which would have given Jack enough time to drive to Rockford to make his call at 6:57 p.m., and then meet with the recruitment officers at 7:15. As Kathy, Chuck, and Maria's parents had begun searching for Maria at 7 p.m., Jack was confirmed to be out of the area during this time, and the phone call seemed like the perfect alibi. After all, how could he be in two places at once? Police then showed Kathy a handful of photos, including 5 from the 1957 Sycamore High School yearbook. Of these photos, Jack's was not included because, remember, he had been expelled earlier that school year. Police were able to get a hold of a photo of Jack from that time from his high school girlfriend. It was this picture that Kathy was able to identify the man that had introduced himself as Johnny. In addition to this photo, Jack's former girlfriend was able to provide police with an unused military-issued train ticket from Rockford to Chicago, dated December 1957. To investigators, this suggested that Jack didn't take the train as he had previously claimed, but did go to Rockford and spoke with several people there. He theoretically would have been able to obtain the ticket to imply that he would be traveling by train and use this ticket as an alibi if need be. A high school friend of Jack's told police that he cared immensely for his car and there was no chance that he would have allowed anyone else to drive it. So the idea that he would have potentially loaned out his car to a friend that evening, forcing him to take the train, was thrown out the window. As more and more evidence was being brought to police's attention, they began to act quickly. When they started looking more closely into Jack's history, they found that he had been a former Washington State police officer. The Sycamore police contacted the Seattle Police Department, and they had told them that Jack had moved out of the area several years earlier. Working together, they began building a case against Jack. At the time of the abduction and murder, Jack was 18 and confirmed to be living in the neighborhood. The police then re-questioned Kathy about what exactly had happened that night. When shown pictures of Jack, Kathy had identified him as the man who had approached them and identified himself as Johnny, although she didn't identify him as the man when she was a child. In July of 2011, the Seattle Police Department had officially joined forces with the Illinois State Police on the investigation. They brought in a professional interrogator since Jack had previous law enforcement experience and would know what to say, what not to say, and how to act and react to questioning. At first, he spoke very calmly and by all accounts was acting very cooperative. That is until he was asked questions about Maria and faced questions about her murder. At that point, he became agitated and aggressive. He began speaking in an evasive way, and police knew they were going to get nothing of use from him. He then sat there with his arms crossed and refused to answer any more questions. Jack was then extradited to Illinois, where he was tried for the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridulph. Later that month, Maria's body was exhumed. They were hoping to find some DNA evidence that would conclusively link Jack to the crime, but none could be found. A forensic anthropologist did find that Maria had been stabbed at least 3 times in the neck by what he determined to be a long, sharp blade. The nicks on her sternum and vertebrae were consistent, with at least 3 slashes to her throat. It is possible that the stabbing was her cause of death. However, the timeline could not be concluded, as there was the possibility that she could have been strangled prior to her stabbing. This, too, was called into question as the decomposition of the soft tissue made it difficult to pinpoint one or the other exactly. During the trial in September of 2012, the prosecution had suggested that Jack was attracted to Maria and he decided to kidnap her, but for whatever reason, ended up killing her instead. There had been suspicions of Jack molesting Maria, but it was not brought up in court or factored into their statement, since at the time, there was no concrete proof of this, only speculation. In addition to the prosecution's star witness, Kathy, who herself identified Jack as Johnny, several of Maria's family members, neighbors, and members of law enforcement testified as well. One of Maria's childhood friends had testified that a man named Johnny had offered her a piggyback ride too, and identified Jack in the courtroom. While in jail, 3 inmates had testified that he had talked about killing Maria. However, there were several inconsistencies with their stories, including saying that Maria was stabbed, that she was strangled with a wire, and that Jack had accidentally smothered her to death. Based on the forensic evidence at the time, none of this was true. The defense team had argued that the police were under severe pressure from both the Ridulph and the Tessier family to solve the case, and that Jack was hastily implicated for the crime, even though there was no physical evidence, motive, or indication that Jack was present in the area at the exact time of Maria's kidnapping. Jack's attorneys had advised him to not take the stand in his own defense. On September 14th, 2012, Jack McCullough, who was 73 years old at the time, was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridulph and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Very soon after, Jack had appealed all of his convictions. On February 13th, 2015, the Illinois Appellate Court had upheld the murder conviction, but lifted the conviction for the kidnapping, as the statute of limitations was no longer in effect for the 1957 crime. As you can imagine, this really had no effect on his life sentence, as time was being served for this more serious crime. Fast forward, a new prosecutor from DeKalb County, Illinois, is on the scene. He reviewed Jack's case and came to the conclusion that he couldn't possibly have been the one to kidnap and murder Maria all those years ago. He then ordered a new investigation because he found Jack's original alibi to be solid. Remember, there were several people he had interacted with while away from town, as well as the phone call that had placed him more than 30 miles away from Sycamore at the very time of the abduction. Later in 2015, Jack had filed a petition for post-conviction relief, requesting that his murder conviction be set aside. His petition was initially dismissed as being frivolous and without merit, but his former public defender, who had kept in contact with him well after the trial, had continued to look into the case, despite the fact that he was no longer representing Jack, and had asked the court to reconsider Jack's dismissal. In addition, Jack had filed a successive motion that could not be denied without a hearing from the state's attorney's office. After the motions were heard, in response, the county state's attorney was replaced and had conducted an extensive review of the evidence, which led him to the conclusion that there was no way Jack could have committed this crime and that he was innocent. According to the previous state's attorney, evidence was kept out of the trial that clearly established Jack's whereabouts on the evening of Maria's abduction and supported his alibi. One piece of evidence in particular was the phone call he made at the post office payphone that evening to his mother from Rockford to Sycamore, and the distance between the two towns, and given the icy road conditions at the time. Remember, it was December, and a fresh layer of snow had fallen earlier in the evening. He argued that it wasn't possible for him to get from Rockford to Sycamore and then back to Rockford to make his call and establish his alibi. He would have had to have been in Rockford the whole time. On April 15th, 2016, the judge vacated Jack's original conviction and sentence and ordered a new trial. Although he remained charged with the crime, Jack was released on bond that same day, pending the new trial. A week later, the charges against him were dismissed. However, the dismissal of the murder charge was without prejudice, which meant that he could not be tried again for Maria's murder if another prosecutor chose to do so. Chuck, Maria's brother, had requested a special prosecutor be brought in to handle the case. Although he had garnered several hundred signatures from people in town, the request was ultimately denied. Chuck then said that he would not appeal the ruling. The prosecutor asked the judge to throw out Jack's conviction based on the conclusion of the new investigation, and believe it or not, the judge did in fact dismiss all charges against him. Jack McCullough was then declared innocent of the crime on April 12, 2017. Jack, then 78 years old, sued the state of Illinois and received a settlement of $445,000. He then went after the Seattle Police Department for their involvement in his conviction and received a settlement for $300,000. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Maria's brother Chuck is still alive, and I think we can all agree that we hope he one day gets answers and that his sister's killer is brought to justice. Let me know what you think. Do you think this case was handled the right way? Did police ignore important things and let some things slide? Do you think that her killer is still out there? This was definitely such a sad case, and I'm sorry to say that there is no resolution. At least not at this time. But I'm still hopeful. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.